Welcome to Second Sunday Forum, a program of the West Falmouth Peace and Social Order Committee of the Quakers. Today is Sunday, January 12th, 2025, and our speaker is Andrew Gottlieb, who is the Association to Preserve Cape Cod's Executive Director, among other things. His talk today is APCC's view of Cape Cod's environmental challenges in 2025. Specifically, before I say that, we're on Wampanoag land, and this is being recorded and will be posted with Andrew's permission on our YouTube link. Cape Cod faces ongoing challenges to its environmental quality. Water quality continues to be impacted by excess septic nutrient loading, stormwater, and fertilizers. Critical habitat areas are threatened by the development pressures, including the need to increase affordable housing stock. Rapid and intense changes to climate are changing how our environment functions. Addressing these and other challenges require aggressive, thoughtful action. Andrew Gottlieb's APCC's Executive Director will address APC's approach to protecting the environment in 2025 and beyond. A question and answer period follows. Please put that in the chat. Thank you. Andrew?
Well, thank you, Erica, and good morning, everybody. So, as Erica mentioned, APCC is, we've been around since 1968. We're the region's leading environmental advocacy and education organization. We're involved in all manner of environmental policy conversations relevant to Cape Cod, whether it's water quality, land use, municipal policy around open space, protection of resources, restoration of environmental resources, all of which I'll talk about in a little bit. So as we look at 2025, I think that, it's clear that there's going to be significant changes in federal environmental policy. And we've made a somewhat conscious choice to, in part, respond to the anticipated changes at the federal level by increasing our efforts to engage with and motivate local government, by extension, the people who live in the Cape communities, to do more to improve the things that we have control over. A lot of environmental organizations are going to be spending a lot of time pushing back on changes at the federal level. We will be too, but it's not where the emphasis of our work is going to be in the coming years. I think in the coming years, we think that there's still a lot that can be done locally, whether it's motivating people to get out and voting for wastewater infrastructure investments, identifying and acquiring areas of critical habitat, developing restoration and implementing restoration plans for degraded natural resources, particularly coastal and freshwater wetland systems. There's a lot that we can and need to be doing locally. And so we're going to be putting our energy there where we feel that collectively we can all make a difference. Objecting to those things we think are objectionable, but not losing sight of the fact that locally there's a lot we can do to improve our stewardship of existing resources. So I got a couple things just to show you folks to frame our perspective on what's happening. And the first is our annual State of the Waters report. So some of you may be aware of the fact that for the last 6 years, APCC has been evaluating the quality of water supply systems, estuarine resources, and pond resources, and issuing a report on that. And so I'm going to run through that really quickly because it kind of sets the table on how we view the world. And what you'll see here is there are 21 public water supply systems on Cape Cod. And green stars are indicative of those water systems that are providing water that meets all state and federal health standards to its customers. And you'll see that of 19 of the 21, that is in fact the case. You will notice, however, that a number of those green stars have circles around them. Those circles are indicative of water systems that identified concentrations below state and federal standards, but present nonetheless, of so-called PFAS, perfluorinated compounds, forever chemicals, maybe something you're familiar with hearing about them. And so what that indicates to us is that while these systems are managing this issue fairly well, the existence of PFAS in our groundwater is pretty ubiquitous. And it's ubiquitous not because of individual locations that are direct sources of extreme volumes of contamination, although we have a few. Fire Training Academy in Barnstable County being one, the Otis Air Force Base being another that come to mind. But that these chemicals, because they are so widely distributed in consumer products, are fairly widely distributed in the waste stream that comes from the utilization of septic systems, and therefore pretty widely distributed in our groundwater. Two of the systems, Bourne Water District, Buzzards Bay Water District, had good quality water. They had some reporting issues that resulted in them not being excellent. On the ponds, the story is somewhat different in that roughly, a pond that shows up red has exhibited poor water quality in the year that we evaluated. Blue ponds had better water or good water quality, and roughly, just around a third of the ponds that we look at on a year-to-year basis exhibit poor water quality. Comes from one or two criteria. One is something known as a general trophic index, which is sort of a broad measure of pond health. The other basis upon which these ponds are evaluated is whether or not they had cyanobacteria blooms sufficiently dense to have warranted closure or a recommendation of limited access from the municipality. And year over year, as we've been looking at these ponds, somewhere close to a third of the ponds exhibit poor water quality. Slightly over half of them are what we would consider to be of marginal quality, which means that on any given year, some years they're good, some years they're not so good. And that is influenced in large part by local weather conditions and whether the presence or absence of heavy tropical type downpours that have become more characteristic of our weather patterns as climate change takes hold. Those large storms can wash large volumes of nutrient load from lawns and gardens around the ponds through stormwater control structures that discharge to the ponds into the ponds where it becomes available for as a food source for cyanobacteria blooms that can result in these quick jolts of food that activate a bloom. We look at about 150 of the 890 ponds, so this is a relatively small snapshot, but it is cause for concern and evidence of the fact that our ponds are being impacted by excess nutrient loading, much like our estuaries are. For our estuaries, you'll see here that this map looks a lot like the 2023 map if you've been following this. And the reason for that is it is a 2023 map. And the reason it's a 2023 map is that we didn't go to the trouble, frankly, of rescoring the estuaries this year because 90% of them in 2023 exhibited poor water quality, and nothing has happened that would make us think that any of them got any better in the intervening year. The reason for that isn't because people aren't doing anything. In fact, you're seeing greater investment at the municipal level of moving forward with projects than we ever have before. But it takes a while for these projects to begin to reduce the loading that allows these waterways to get better. And we just simply haven't seen sufficient implementation to not only stop a meaningful loading from coming in by retiring septic systems and connecting those homes treated to septic systems to municipal sewer. So not enough of those connections have taken place to make a difference, let alone the residual nitrogen that was in the groundwater passing through the systems and no longer providing the food source. So while on the downside, the fact that 90% of our estuaries are exhibiting sufficiently high nutrient loads to cause poor water quality, that's the bad part. The good part is that towns have gotten the message, and most importantly, the voters in those towns have gotten the message that solving this problem is not that complicated. And solving the problem, while expensive, quite frankly, is affordable given a number of the tools that are available to municipalities to mitigate the cost of implementing wastewater management to their taxpayers. So if you step back from what these reports show, it explains why a lot of the work we're doing is focused around water quality, and that the form of that work takes many faces. One is we'll continue to work with voters and town officials to advance the next phases of wastewater infrastructure, financing, and funding in those communities where they have begun the process of building or expanding on core wastewater treatment facilities that are, we think, the backbone of the improvement that we need to have in order to restore these estuaries. So we do a lot of work advocating with the communities to move those projects forward. And I'll say, generally speaking, that is happening with great success and increasing ease. If you look at some recent votes in fall of 2024, town of Dennis voted almost unanimously at their town meeting to commit $248 million to wastewater infrastructure investment. Year prior, town of Yarmouth unanimously supported a $207 million investment. Town of Barnstable is spending about $100 million a year. Town of Mashpee's up over $100 million with fairly wide spread support for the votes at those projects. Orleans is well over $150 million. And all of these projects have been done and authorized without any meaningful impact on the property tax base. And a lot of the work that we've done in the previous few years has been to create the tools that towns needed in order to make wastewater affordable. And so now we're making sure that towns are taking advantage of those opportunities. The other form our work is taking is we are working pretty diligently on bringing higher levels of attention to the level of effort that's being applied to improving freshwater quality. The numbers I showed you on freshwaters earlier would indicate, on one hand, that it seems like our ponds are in somewhat less bad shape than our estuaries. I think while that's generally true, it's also reflective of a couple of things, which is that we know a lot less over a longer period of time about our ponds than we do about our estuaries. As we learn more, we're finding more and more problems. It also reflects the fact that municipal investment in an awareness of the need to protect water quality is not on a par with that we now have for the estuaries. The lakes have, for the most part, been seen as secondary to the marine environment. The emphasis was on improving water quality in the marine setting. And there is no town on Cape Cod that has a comprehensive plan for addressing the quality of their freshwater resources. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is to try and remedy that situation. And we do it through two primary means. One is we run a cyanobacteria monitoring program during the, say May through November. where we're looking at about 135 ponds in all 15 towns across the Cape to identify potentially significant cyanobacteria blooms that, because cyanobacteria can result in a creation of different types of neurotoxins, there's a meaningful public health and pet health threat to cyano blooms that is not a feature of poor water quality in the marine environment, and that has captured people's attention and concern. So we run this program again across about 135 of the 890 ponds, so not a sufficiently large sample, but not insignificant by itself, and post those results on an every real-time basis, reflecting monitoring that's occurring every 2 weeks during the period of concern and in different ponds. And that monitoring is reflected on our map, that I will tell you is the most popular thing we post annually. We get more visits to the cyano map. We have more people sign up for email alerts when a pond is experiencing a cyano bloom. Those are the two most popular products that we offer on a year-over-year basis. That has done a lot to raise awareness and begin to create a platform under which people can begin to argue with their town for enhanced stormwater control, enhanced wastewater treatment around the ponds, and looking for solutions to at least get people to voluntarily eliminate fertilizer loads in properties proximate to ponds, if not regulate or restrict them outright. The second form that our lake work takes is in a project that that we are doing with the Cape Cod Commission, and I'm not sure, trying to bring up that report. Give me a second, please. The Freshwater Initiative is a project that, as I said, we're doing with Cape Cod, under a contract with the Cape Cod Commission, and that seeks to look at and characterize the, do you have that now? The water quality of 50 representative ponds. And so we've been doing this work now for 2 years. It will allow us to understand more broadly baseline water quality in the ponds. It allow us to understand more broadly the health and habitat quality that supports a variety and a diverse range of flora and fauna. And we'll begin to answer a lot of the questions that we have about freshwater quality. So as I mentioned before, Cape has 890 freshwater ponds. Most of them were created by retreating glaciers that carved out depressions in the landscape that were connected, to the underlying aquifer. And our ponds are interesting in that they are really a window into the quality of our groundwater. That said, we don't know as much about them as we'd like. So ponds, there's a lot of different types of ponds on the Cape. They vary in depth, they vary in surface area, they vary to the extent to which they're connected both through groundwater and streams that leave the ponds and flow to the marine environment, which then serve as the pathways of a lot of our anadromous fish. People think most clearly or often about herring, using those streams to get back up to their historic spawning grounds. But eels also use them, white perch also use them, lampreys use them. There's a whole variety of species that go up and down between these systems And that creates some real variability in how these ponds behave and what their utility is from an environmental services perspective. Like I said, we have a variety of different types of fish communities, invasive plants, and frankly, in some respects, invasive fish, in that stocking programs are introducing, for recreational purposes, trout into waters that they would not normally occur. It's been known to be true that individual fishermen have introduced other species they consider to be desirable, primarily largemouth bass, into a lot of these ponds that all have changes in how how these ponds function, fish stocking and other interventions, whether it's a herring run that allows the town to control flow level of the pond, therefore flow in the outflowing stream, cranberry cultivation, chemical treatments by some towns in some instances, presence of docks, boats, all sorts of human activity. So there's a lot going on in our freshwater environment. These ponds are all unique, but they are all interconnected, as I said, to some extent with the groundwater, some discharges mentioned to coastal estuaries, and they're influenced by things that broadly affect all the resources on the Cape. Nutrient sources, wastewater is a primary source of nutrient load in both our fresh and marine waters, as a result of our choice to use septic systems as a primary means for rudimentary wastewater treatment. Nutrients from those untreated or poorly treated septic effluent plumes impact both our fresh waters and our marine waters. Climate change is having an impact. Our waters are warmer. They're more hospitable to algae growth in particular, cyanobacteria growth. They are subject to, as I mentioned earlier, significant heavy volume rainstorms, which bring heavy nutrient loads into the ponds. And then water levels are constantly changing in response to climate, both drought, inundation, sea level rise are all having an effect on these systems. What's happening in the landscape affects them. You said septic systems put phosphorus and nitrogen into the groundwater, flows into the groundwater, finds its way into the ponds. Invasive vegetations, some of those tall stands of marsh reeds that you look at and say, "Oh, aren't those pretty?" Actually are invasive, have very low habitat value, and outcompete native plants that the species in and around our ponds have evolved to utilize. So they are a potential problem. Fertilizer application off the land all impact what's happening in our ponds. So what are we doing? Freshwater Initiative, as I mentioned, is a program that was funded by Barnstable County for 3 years. We are just completing year 2. APCC was selected by the Cape Cod Commission to undertake the monitoring program. So we're doing 50 ponds that are representative of the different types of ponds that I just described, the ponds that are deep, the ponds that are shallow, the ponds that are heavily developed watersheds, somewhat more lightly developed watersheds, all in an attempt to understand what the water quality conditions are. We monitor each of those ponds, and there's at least a few in each one of the 15 towns. We monitor them during the course of the period between March and through November. So when the ponds are mixing initially in the early part of the spring, when they become stratified and temperature separated during the typical summer months, and then through the fall period when the water cools and the bottom waters mix again. And as part of that monitoring, we're beginning to work with the commission to develop a understanding of baseline water quality conditions, which would then feed strategies on how to deal with the information and how to deal with both ongoing monitoring needs as well as interventions. So what we're hoping to be able to do over the course of this year and going forward is to, one, work with the county to identify the funds to allow this initiative to continue moving forward, whether it's with APCC or not. A 3-year project is not sufficient to broadly characterize and change the nature of the conversation about freshwater systems, but also to begin to analyze the data that we found to establish relationships between which ponds might benefit from certain types of management interventions. So we can begin working with the community across the Cape to tell people these are the things you'd want to do regardless of what type of pond you have. You want to limit inflow of nutrients. You want to eliminate fertilizer use in the watershed. You want to remove direct stormwater discharges from these ponds. In some ponds, that will be adequate to solve or abate the water quality problems. In other systems, stopping the inflow of new nutrient load may be a necessary but insufficient thing to do. And it might require additional in-pond interventions to break what is known as nutrient recycling. And very quickly, one of the things that complicates ponds compared to the estuaries is if you stop the flow of nitrogen to the estuary, you're going to see improvement. And the means to do that is through improving septic wastewater treatment. In the ponds, the nutrient of concern is less nitrogen and more phosphorus. Phosphorus moves differently in the groundwater, doesn't move as far as fast. And so the area you want to manage can be somewhat lesser. However, phosphorus tends to accumulate in bottom sediments. So if you think of all the leaves that fall in a pond naturally during the course of the year, all the algae that was in the pond, perhaps from a cyanobloom, during the middle of the summer that dies back when the water cools, all of that sinks to the bottom and creates a partially decomposed layer of organic matter that, like all organic matter, includes nutrients like phosphorus. Under good water quality conditions, phosphorus stays connected to the sediments. They bind to the sediments, and are, while in the pond, not generally available to promote plant growth. In poor water quality conditions, like we're seeing more and more, ponds lose their oxygen at the bottom of the pond. So-called, it's known as anoxia. And when the waters at the bottom become anoxic, there's a chemical reaction that occurs that allows the phosphorus to release from the sediments, move up the water column, be available to feed the next generation of plant matter in that pond that then dies, settles to the bottom, and sits waiting for the next water quality, contributing to, and then waiting for the next poor water quality round to occur before that phosphorus releases. So it's a negative feedback loop that degrades the overall quality of the water. And what one does to break that cycle is complicated. There's a chemical treatment called alum that is somewhat successful in strengthening the bond between the phosphorus and the sediments, and holds it in place so it does not feed the next generation of algae. That can work in some cases. It can be a Band-Aid if that's all you're doing. There are other techniques and technologies that are being looked at, like the introduction of so-called nanobubbles of oxygen, very small bubbler systems. Think about a bubbler in a fish tank. It's bubbling water up from the gravel. By oxygenating the lower levels of the pond, that can contribute to keeping that bottom layer from becoming anoxic. So that's being piloted in a couple of ponds in Orleans. We're all monitoring that information to see how effective that system can become. So certain ponds that have internal recycling of nutrients would all benefit from reduction of new loads, and it's really a prerequisite to any effective management strategy. But in and of itself, it's not sufficient to solve the problem. And so we're hoping to utilize the freshwater initiative to come up with the techniques and methodologies that we need in order to improve water quality in the pond. So a lot of our work through the advocacy and through the monitoring is going to be focused around freshwater and making freshwater restoration and protection efforts at the municipal level on a par with what's being experienced on the marine side in most of our towns. So given the size and scope of that problem, we have our work cut out for us for the next several years. Last major thing I just want to touch on, I want to leave some time for some discussion, is our resource restoration work. APCC about a decade ago created a program around the notion that restoring our degraded coastal and fresh and inland wetland resources was an important thing for us to be doing because, you know, well-functioning wetlands provide a number of ecological services. They support a wide range of species and habitat that rely on both fresh, brackish, and marine waters. They act as nutrient sinks. They're very efficient systems in removing nutrients from water, from the groundwater, and from surface waters that flow through them or into which they have contact. And they provide enormous flood control benefits by providing nature's way of allowing water that flows in excess off the landscape, a place where it can go, settle, and slowly be released back into the environment. Always important, but more important now than ever, given the increasing impacts of climate change that are changing rainfall patterns in a way that we're having fewer but bigger storm events. They're creating floodwaters that were not normal 10, 15, 20 years ago as a regular occurrence. And so by restoring our coastal and freshwater wetland systems, we're buying ourselves time to adapt to climate change impacts. So there's a lot of reason to do this work. We've been doing it, as I mentioned, for a decade now. 2024 was really sort of a watershed year for us in that we saw an opportunity a couple of years ago when the federal government began passing numerous significant pieces of legislation, the most important of which, for our purposes, was the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided hundreds of millions of dollars nationwide for a variety of water programs, resource restoration among them. So we geared up, invested in staff, invested in some of the work that we saw we'd need to do in order to create a suite of projects that would be nationally competitive for federal funding for restoration. And we're successful in 2024 in obtaining two significant grants, either of which by themselves would be the biggest thing we've ever been awarded. Taken together, they're even bigger. So we are the recipients of about $17.5 million of federal money for restoration of 6 wetland systems on Cape Cod. A little bit heavily concentrated in the Upper Cape, Oyster Pond and Falmouth on the west side of Falmouth, Upper Requasha River in Mashpee, Mashpee River in Mashpee, Red Brook in Mashpee and Falmouth, right on the town line, Weir Creek in Dennis, and a bog restoration in partnership with the Harwich Conservation Trust in the town of Harwich. So those grants came through in late 2024. and are going to be shaping the work that we're doing across the region with a wide range of municipal and other nonprofit partners, including Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Reserve, Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe, various towns, Harvest Conservation Trust, Cape Cod Conservation District, to take 6 meaningful projects that have been envisioned and talked about, worked on, and developed over the last several years, to reality of construction over the course of the next 4. And so, the fact that we competed nationally for these projects is something we feel good about. Fact that there were only 5 projects nationally that were larger than ours, and only one of those was more than a couple $100,000 larger than ours, shows that there's a national interest in what happens on Cape Cod, and that leading a team of partners, APCC has been able to make an impact on a national scale for resource restoration locally. So we're feeling very good about that, and we're working on securing some additional money later this spring that will fund and seed the development of the next round of projects that might avail themselves of certainly state funding that's available, and new federal money when and if the fever breaks in Washington after the next 4 years. So there's a ton going on. I know I didn't touch on everything that folks had on their mind, or that Eric asked me to talk about, but I do want to leave a little bit of time. So I will stop here with one additional caveat, which is, we are, as an organization, a membership-driven organization. More members makes us stronger, not just because the financial support that comes from that, but also one of the things that we pride ourselves in is being able to effectively communicate with our membership and give them effective, useful guidance on when to intervene and engage in a particular issue. So the more members we have, the more influence we have. And I will cite the effective work that we're able to do to prevent the Upper Cape water supply from being jeopardized by the construction of the multipurpose machine gun range at Joint Base Cape Cod as an example of our ability to engage membership, have membership act, and have it actually influence decision makers. And the example I'll give you is that we were fighting an extension of the funding in Congress in the 2025 National Defense Authorization Act. And we asked our membership to contact both Congressman Keating and Senator Warren, both of whom sit on this respective House and Senate Armed Services Committee, to ask them to intervene to get this particular funding extension stricken from the bill. 990 something people sent emails to Congressman Keating. His office was then able to print those out, and allowed him to walk into the chairman's office and put a stack this thick of communication from his membership on the chairman's desk to make the point that people care, and people are engaged, and people have concerns about this. And I know from firsthand conversation that that degree of engagement locally influenced Congressman's thinking and understanding of this project, and it influenced the Republican Oklahoman chair of the Armed Services Committee's thinking on this. So I'm going to ask you to, if you're not a member now, to become one, because I think that it allows us to help you reflect your views on what's important to Cape Cod's environment in a way that I'm not sure any other environmental organization on Cape Cod does. So with that, I will stop.
Okay, I'm going to ask first, Steve Gates said, "Hi, Andrew, do you have any concerns about the quality of the water supply on the Cape?" There were 4 questions, 3 more.
Sure. So I will start that answer, which is going to be yes, with the caveat that, as I said, our data shows that the water suppliers are delivering high quality water to consumers. Cautionary note here is that, because we rely on septic systems, much of what you put down the drain or you put in your body and is excreted from your body and then goes down the drain ends up in the groundwater. The septic systems do not treat for a variety of compounds. They don't do much for caffeine. They don't do much for antidepressants. They don't do much to remove chemotherapy drugs. They don't remove volatile organic compounds. There's a whole bunch of stuff that they don't take out. And because we are very diffusely introducing those compounds into our groundwater, we should be concerned about it. So water quality for the drinking water systems is pretty good. And it's pretty good for one reason only. Groundwater around drinking water supplies was protected starting in the 1970s and 80s by a concerted public effort to buy land around water supply wells and future wells, and to zone the areas that contribute water to our wells to manage or eliminate the most hazardous land use activities away from the wells. And the result of that active management strategy has been pretty good water quality. That is a perpetual and ongoing job. And if we get lax about it, we have pretty good indications that we would have a degradation of our water supply. So generally, I feel good about it, but you can't let feeling good about it take your eye off the ball.
Thank you. From Paula Blumenthal first, and then John Carroll. Paula asks, can you speak to homeowners using a urine diversion system? Is it helpful? Can it be done with the holding tanks when full? Aside from stopping fertilizer use on lawns and gardens, what else can we do to lower nitrogen levels?
Okay, so start with the second one first. Just don't fertilize. Plain and simple. We have a lot of information on our APCC website on how to landscape in ways that are supportive of and not in opposition to nature. That includes restoration of native planting types. We have poor sandy soils. Plants that are native to this area like those poor sandy soils. And if you restore those to your landscape, you won't need to fertilize and you'll still have a nice looking yard. A lot of the more suburban place type plantings that came along with a lot of the suburban style development that characterized the Cape since the 1980s doesn't want to be here. And that goes for your lawn as well. And you need to chemically support those non-native plants in order for them to look the way people want them to look. So stopping fertilizing to start, going back to native plantings in your yard is an improvement. Limiting or eliminating pure turf grass lawns in your yard is also a very helpful feature, allowing the introduction of what the lawn care industry would consider broadleaf weeds into your yard, in particular clover and mosses, will provide the ability to have a more sustainable yard that doesn't require fertilizers, that will frankly stay green during periods of drought much longer than cultivated lawns. As to urine diversion, so it's a complicated set of questions. Basically, for those that aren't familiar, there are toilet systems. They're popular in some parts of Europe. They don't have a lot of market penetration in the United States, that have two ways of disposing of waste that goes in the toilet. One is, the urine is discharged into into a portion of the toilet and then drain down to a tank and does not go into septic system, goes into a holding tank, which is then pumped out and the urine disposed of elsewhere. That reduces significantly the nitrogen load coming from a septic system. That said, while effective in reducing nitrogen loads, there are a number of questions that are out there about that hinder the widespread adoption and acceptance of this on a societal basis. As of right now, there is no infrastructure to do anything with that urine that's collected in the tanks. So where it goes is a legitimate question. There are parts of Europe that utilize it as a fertilizer, and that doesn't yet happen in the United States. So where it goes is a question. The acceptability of it from a societal point of view, it is one of those things that relies on personal behavior. And it's very difficult from a regulatory perspective to factor in personal compliance with behavioral changes into determination of what an adequate response to reducing nutrient load is. So a urine diverting toilet, as I said, if you're careful with where you pee, it goes to a tank. If you're not, it goes to your septic system. Person A may be completely committed and compliant with the method. Person they sell their house to, person they rent to, person who visits their home, maybe less so. So how you factor in that degree of compliance is a complex question to which I've yet to hear a particularly good answer. Lastly, because it's not widely accepted, there's a reluctance for people to convert to those types of systems, in part because sometimes the layout of the house makes it difficult to have a diversion tank right underneath your toilet in an effective way to remodel the house. The other is that there's concerns about its reducing your potential resale market. So I've been accused of being against urine diverting toilets. I guess I'm not sure that's a fair characterization. I am concerned about that being put forward as the solution that obviates the need to invest in more municipal wastewater treatment infrastructure, because that is the one known reliable method that we have for lowering nutrient loads in our ponds and estuaries. And we've been living with the degradation that has come from poorly managed wastewater for so long. Personally, we have a reluctance to say, now that we finally cracked the code on how to do this, let's stop doing it and hope that we can get people to individually change their behavior in a way and how they manage their waste in their own homes that is exponentially more intrusive than a lot of the other things we've asked them to do, whether it's minimizing fertilizer, recycling, using less water, that history has shown us people have been pretty poor at doing. So urine diversion has a role. I don't view it as a replacement for ongoing investment in core sewer systems.
We have a lot of questions. One from David Dow: for wetland restoration, how is it related to the state climate change and biodiversity campaign and federal funding sources post 2024?
So restored wetlands provide buffers to the near-term effects of climate change. Healthy salt marshes are very effective nitrogen or carbon sinks. Well-functioning coastal marsh systems hold a lot of carbon. and keep it out of the atmosphere. Degraded and degrading and declining health estuaries actually release meaningful carbon from the sediment load into the atmosphere. So there's clearly a relationship there. The ability of these systems, when functioning and healthy, to absorb storm surge, to reduce flooding of other resources in the built environment is significant. So clearly, these systems properly maintained and restored are part of a climate agenda. So from a strategic point of view, it's our view that the incoming administration will disinvest in this area, given their clearly stated views about climate change, and we'll be looking to pull money back and away from investment in resource restoration, in part because they're generally hostile to the environment, in part because they view it as part of a woke campaign to address what they consider to be a climate hoax. So we're not viewing and we're not investing a ton of time and energy into securing future federal funding because we think it's going to dry up in the next several years. We do, however, see Commonwealth of Massachusetts as an ongoing source of investment and support for a lot of these projects. And so we have changed our approach to seeking additional funding for wetland restoration projects away from the big projects that we and bundled clusters of projects that we successfully got funded from the NOAA grant last year into smaller, more digestible state budget sized pieces that we will be able to pursue and hopefully successfully fund through a variety of additional state sources. We're concerned to a degree that with the pullback on the federal level, depending on how wide and deep it is, it's going to put a lot of pressure on state budgets, not just Massachusetts, but state budgets everywhere, Massachusetts perhaps in particular, because of some of the likelihood that some of the cuts will be disproportionately focused on states like Massachusetts, that discretionary resources, some of which have gone to fund environmental investment, will be under a lot more pressure just because the state budget's going to be under so much pressure, because there are going to be gaps created across the board, whether it's in healthcare, social services, environment, sheltering, you name it. So, in the short term, we have a lot of work that we've got teed up that we're going to aggressively pursue from state funding sources. Check with me in 2 years when we see how this whole story is unfolded, how that all feels.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. One from Molly Cornell. She said she'd like a better understanding of phosphorus mitigation in ponds, a Shumet pond, for example.
Sure. So, phosphorus mitigation, as I mentioned, is a challenging question. So, a lot of ponds have a significant phosphorus load naturally occurring that's locked up in their sediments. Ponds like a Shumet that have had significant additional external inputs of phosphorus. A Shumet coming from the old wastewater treatment plant at then Otis Air Force Base, now Joint Base Cape Cod, represents a uniquely significantly different system. The go-to right now is alum treatments, and the Shumet Pond has had 1 or 2, I forget, and is likely and is queued up and has actually just had a contract for another one awarded by the town using some town money and some base money to do it. The experience with Ashumet is not unlike the experience with other ponds, which is the alum treatment worked for a while, and then new inputs of phosphorus overwhelm the ability of the alum to hold phosphorus biounavailable at the bottom of the pond, and it needs to be done again. The threat with alum is it's aluminum sulfate, so it's a heavy metal, and in low concentrations in the right place, applied properly, indications are that it can be done without broad-scale environmental harm. At some point, you put too much heavy metal in the pond, you create toxicity of its own, which is why in-pond treatments need to be paired with methods to reduce the inflow of new nutrient load to extend the utility of the phosphorus applications that might have been done, and to give time for those other interventions to restore the overall water quality and health of the pond. As I said, ponds that are not degraded are much less likely to have anoxic conditions at the bottom, and it's the anoxia that releases the phosphorus. So if you can use alum to break the cycle, do a bunch of other stuff to prevent additional degradation through new nutrient loads and other restorations, if you improve the overall water quality of the pond, you can break that cycle and avoid the need for subsequent alum treatments. That last part is appealing, is largely theoretical, in that we don't have enough experience with broad scale restoration of freshwater systems to actually have seen that happen. But that's the theory, and that's the way we're going to be approaching, trying to encourage towns that want to do alum to do all the other hard work that's necessary to make things better in the long term for the pond.
There are 3 questions, and I'm kind of going to bundle them together. One is about asking about the quantity, not quality, of the water in Cape Cod. And the other 2 are talking about the quality, not the quantity. And one from Tom Bigota Payton says, I'm concerned about the levels of PFAS in the drinking water and understand even tiny amounts can cause neurological problems. And how is this being monitored or addressed? Rosa Whiting wonders about the microplastics in the water, and are they being addressed on Cape Cod? And again, a quantity issue is addressed by Steve.
Okay. I got to leave it to my friend Rose to ask a question I don't have an answer to, which is on the microplastics. That's not, we don't have a program area looking at microplastics, and I'm hesitant to offer an answer to that because it's really outside of our area of organizational expertise, other than to know that it's a problem, and it's a growing problem, because almost everything we use now is plastic. In terms of the PFAS compounds, Massachusetts regulates 6. There are about 16,000. Massachusetts regulating 6 puts Massachusetts in the top 5 states nationally in terms of the number of PFAS compounds regulated in drinking water. EPA has recently come out with some new standards that set no limit, declare basically no amount of PFAS from drinking water is safe. But again, it, I think, regulates about 20 of them. So we don't have a very good regulatory answer to how to deal with PFAS in drinking water. So I don't have a good answer for that question. I think that drinking water is only one road of exposure to PFAS compounds, and it may or may not be the most significant one. PFAS is in the bloodstream of, last number I heard, 90% of the mammals alive on the planet. Not just people, it's everywhere. And the clothes you're wearing right now are probably PFAS coated. The carpet you're walking on is probably PFAS coated. The chair you're sitting in with anti-stain fabric or stain-resistant fabric. Has PFAS in it. So does the upholstery in your car. The rain repellent rain gear you might be wearing has it. So you're being exposed to it in all manner of places, drinking water being one of them. And the only place there's any meaningful control of it is through drinking water. So it's a huge societal issue that I'm not sure we have. Quite frankly, I know we don't have an answer to. And I'm not sure as a society that we have the capacity to develop an answer for it. I don't have a good answer on PFAS either. As to water quantity, plenty of water on the Cape. Our aquifer is thick and deep, and we have a lot of water. The part of the quantity question that I worry about is not running out of water, but it's the pumping of water, especially during the summer, to meet summertime peaks, which has two components to it. One is there's just more people here during the summer, taking more water. The other is use of water for lawn irrigation, and that's a significant portion of the water demand on the Cape during the growing season, as it is everywhere. When that pumping is required to meet those needs, the top layer of the aquifer is diminished, and it's that top layer, those top inches, if not feet, that when dewatered result in lower groundwater levels that feed our ponds, lower groundwater levels that feed our wetlands, lower groundwater levels that support vernal pools and the variety of life that's in them. So it's the upper portion that's of most concern to us. And that is why, practices and policies that promote less water use during the critical growing periods, because that's when our aquifers are the most vulnerable, are important things. It's not an overall quantity basis concern. It's a impact on the most sensitive upper levels of our aquifer that impact resources you can see above the ground that concerns us the most.
Well, it's 1:30, and if there's anything you'd like to conclude with this, Andrew, please continue.
Just again, I want to thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to listen. And my parting message is, if you don't think your town is doing a good enough job managing its environmental resources, you need to go and speak up at town meetings, select board meetings, find candidates who will speak to these issues. And if you can't find a candidate you think does it well enough, you ought to think about doing it yourself. Participation matters. Offering comments on Facebook doesn't matter. Doesn't move the needle. If you want to participate, actually participate for real. And if you choose to, environmental voices can have a lot of sway in what happens on the Cape.
Very well ended. Thank you very much, Andrew, and everybody who attended today. Stay well and be active.